because I don't, okay. All right. So anyway, again, welcome. My name is Chris DeRosa. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters up here in Arlington. I am also I have been serving as a coordinator of the League's State Redistricting Committee since about October of 2019. So I mentioned that we're going to be recording. We appreciate it if you could keep yourself muted so that we can hear our speakers without interruption. And we do have the chat available, so you can put questions there. We do plan to have time at the end so we can answer some of your questions. And if there's time left over, we can have people even raise their hands to ask questions. So we are glad again that you have joined us. This is part 2 of our community of interest training with a team from Tufts University. If you joined us Tuesday or Wednesday, you learned about the representable tool, which was produced by Princeton University. So we have 2 great tools for you to learn to use. You'll use a Districtr tool from Tufts, MGGG. There's 3 G's in it, redistricting team. And you will be able to use this tool to map your community of interest and submit it to the Redistricting Commission. You should be able to draw your own maps when this is done, and you should be able to train other people in your community to use the tool as well. Before you hear from the MGGG team, let me briefly bring you up to date about what's happening with redistricting in Virginia since we passed the amendment on November 3rd. As you probably know, nearly two-thirds of the Virginians voted yes on Amendment 1, and that includes all except 1 of the counties and cities in the Commonwealth. So pretty overwhelming. That one county was mine, Arlington. Unfortunately, they did not approve it. Since that happened, the 4 General Assembly leaders appointed 8 legislators, including 4 delegates and 4 senators to the commission. That was done on December 1st. And those same 4 leaders submitted lists of 16 or more names of citizen applicants to the selection committee. They chose those names out of over 1,200 citizen applicants. We were quite impressed and pleased that so many people took an interest and submitted their applications. The selection committee, which consists of 5 retired circuit court justices, met last Wednesday, January 6th. They deliberated and discussed for about 3 hours. And at the end, they had selected 2 citizens from each of the 4 lists for a total of 8 citizen members. Those of us who watched the meeting were impressed for the most part with the seriousness of purpose that the justices took as they were going over the criteria, reviewing applications, and trying to make sure that this was a diverse panel as required in the legislation that was passed. So next, the commission's 16 members will meet on or before February 1st. At that meeting, they will select one of the 8 citizen members as their chair. I also anticipate that they will discuss their process going forward. For example, they need to decide how and when they're going to schedule at least 3 public hearings to hear testimony, as well as other meetings. Obviously, a lot of their map drawing tasks cannot be done until the census data is received, and we are still unclear when that might happen. It could be around March 1st, which of course might affect how the primary elections are run this year. So in the meantime, we're going to encourage citizens throughout Virginia to prepare to submit their testimony and ideas to the commission. There are a couple different ways you can do that. One, there is a portal or a place where you can actually drop in information on the DLS website, Division of Legislative Services. We'll give you that link in a little while. They're the ones that are coordinating all of the redistricting. There will be public hearings, as I mentioned, and there will be other meetings as well. All of those will be open to the public. So later on, we'll find out when those meetings will be held, and they'll probably give us instructions as to how we want to, if we want to speak, how we sign up to do that. So mapping your community of interest is one of the ways that you can get involved and prepare your testimony. The commission must respect communities of interest when drawing maps, and that was specified in legislation that was passed, SB 717 and HB, House Bill 1255, I believe. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce you to the team from Tufts University, the MGGG Redistricting Lab. I'm going to turn it over to Moon Duchin. She's the MGGG's founder and now leads the team, and she can introduce the others.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. And let me make life easier. You can just call us the lab. I know the name is a mouthful.
Struggling with that.
Yeah, I know. So hi, I'm Moon Duchin. I'm a math professor at Tufts. I specialize in geometry, and for the last 5 years in the geometry of redistricting in particular. Because to me, redistricting is basically a big geometry problem. You have a state, you want to cut it up, and the shapes matter, right? So this is like applied geometry. And so we're a research lab. We do peer-reviewed research, and lately have just many papers flying out of the lab on different aspects of the redistricting problem. But we also do a lot of outreach and training. And so I'm so pleased to say that tonight we have a number of wonderful students joining us on this call who are alums of some of our training programs. We run a Voting Rights Data Institute, a geodata boot camp, and so on. Lots of opportunities for students from all different kinds of training and background to come together and learn how to handle this geoelectoral data that makes it possible to really assess districting plans in context. Before I pass it to them, I'll just say a couple other things. One is actually, Chris, about the census data. The boundaries, the new shapes are coming out starting next week, but the numbers of how many people live in each piece of geography won't be out till July at the earliest. Yeah, so quite a bit later than in most years. For me and for many other people who care about best practices in redistricting, this is really great news, late census data, because what it does is it gives us a longer time to really take seriously this communities of interest piece that in past cycles really has kind of been mostly words. It's been hard outside of California. It's been hard to locate a real process for collecting communities of interest. So that's what we're here to tell you about tonight, is the Districtr tool. Some of you already heard about Representable, and actually there are lots and lots of free packages out there. California has their own COI collection tool and so on. It's not the software that matters, it's the concepts. And so that's what we'll focus on tonight, is telling you a little bit about how to do COI collection in a way that's as rich, as informative, as empowering, and as useful as possible, because we want to produce something that's going to help the commission do a better job at their really hard and crucial task. Okay, so I wanted to keep my remarks really brief. I'll pass it over now and just sort of interrupt in a kibitzey way as we go. So I think Julia is going to kick it off.
Yeah, okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, can everybody see what's up here now? Okay. Awesome. Yeah, okay, so we're going to talk today about mapping communities with Districtr. So as we start off, my name is Julia Allen. I'm a sophomore majoring in operations research at Cornell University. In particular, I'm interested in using math to solve social issues. And I started working with the lab this summer. I'll let the rest of my team introduce themselves. So Kat, if you want to go.
Hi, my name is Kat. I'm a graduate student in mathematics at the University of Kentucky, and I've participated in the lab's summer programs for the past 2 years.
Hello, my name is Jorge. I am a sophomore at Swarthmore College, and I am majoring in mathematics, and I participated with MGGG's Geodata Bootcamp this past summer.
Hi, my name is Michael Christie. I am a sophomore computer science major at the University of Connecticut, and I participated in MGGG's summer program as well.
Okay, awesome. Just give me 1 second. Let me fix something with the share. Okay. All right, sorry about that. Yeah, so the goal of this workshop is to learn how to map communities using a tool called Districtr. So along the way, we will provide some examples, and we will walk you through how this process works. After this training, you should also be able to collect community maps and teach others how to use Districtr. So first, we're going to introduce Districtr. Moon put the link in.
Julia, half of your screen is blocked. I don't know if it's just me.
Oh, okay, hold on. I'm not really, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is what I was trying to fix a minute ago. I'm not sure.
It's one of the laws of technology.
Yeah, it's like Zoom just needs to be difficult. Okay.
We'll try one more time, and then if we're still having trouble, we'll switch to another student to share their screen.
Yeah, that might be good.
Still blocked in a few places. Oh, that's better.
Can you see the whole thing?
Yep, I think so.
I'm glad you tech-savvy college students are having some difficulty. Makes me feel a little bit better.
Is it blocked again now, though? I think
it is blocked.
I think it's blocked again.
Switch to another student to share.
Okay, yeah, it seems to
Share
be
my screen if that's helpful.
Yeah, could you do that? Thank you. Yeah, I've not had that specific problem before. I'm sorry. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, so we're going to introduce Districtr, which Moon put in the chat earlier, but in case people joined since then, if someone could put that in there again, that would be great. So we're going to introduce Districtr, talk about redistricting and communities of interest, and then move into a demonstration to show you how to use Districtr. And you can all feel free to use any of these slides to present to communities yourselves. So first of all, yeah, next slide. So what is Districtr? So Districtr is a free public mapping tool for state legislatures, commissions, and community organizers. And so it was developed by a team of mathematicians, data scientists, software developers, geographers, and volunteers over at the lab. And the goal is that we are committed to a fair and open redistricting process. We also built it in partnership with civil rights and community groups in order to customize the tool and make it more real to people's lives. And again, that's at districtr.org, which you should see in the chat. Next slide. So now what can we do with Districtr? So this is a screenshot for the Virginia state landing page. On this page, you can access the map or scroll down to learn more about the rules, open enacted plans, and read about the data in the modules. So by clicking over here on Draw Districts, it will take you to modules where you can draw districts yourself. The cards will tell you what kind of districts you'll draw, the number of districts, and the building blocks on the map. And so we have state landing pages for all 50 states, plus DC and Puerto Rico. It's noteworthy down here that you can build these districts out of either precincts or census block groups. Generally, we want to build out of precincts when we can, but not all states have precinct data fully implemented.
Yeah, I would say that the difference is that precincts are electoral geography. So that's an election administration unit where we'll have accurate counts of how many people voted for what, either for candidates or for, the amendment or what have you. On the other hand, block groups come from, you can go ahead and advance the slide. On the other hand, block groups come from the Census Bureau, and block groups have a lot of socioeconomic data attached to them by the Bureau. So if you want to see things like indicators of who has internet access, who owns a car, block groups would be a good unit to have that kind of data attached.
Yeah, awesome. And by clicking on Draw Communities and following the red path, you can draw what we call communities of interest, or COIs. And these have a legal definition which varies by state, and we will dig into those in a few slides. Next slide. Yeah, so now we're just going to give some background on redistricting and why community mapping is so important. So redistricting is the process of redrawing district boundaries to ensure that each district has the same number of residents. The process restarts every 10 years after the census releases the new population count. The population can change a lot in 10 years, so it's important to rebalance the districts with roughly equal population. As most of you know, the 2020 census just happened, so this redistricting process is going to start happening really soon.
Yeah, to that, it's worth adding that you in Virginia should know very well that there can also be mid-decade redistricting. In Virginia, triggered, for example, by litigation. So when districts are found to violate some of the laws or constitutional principles in place, they may have to be redrawn in between the census releases. There was a question in the chat asking, how good is the correlation between precinct boundaries and census boundaries? And the answer is there's essentially no correlation. And that's because it's the states and sometimes locals like county officials or even city or town officials. That's who gets to control the precinct geometry. Block groups, for the most part, the Census Bureau tries to keep them stable over decades, over many decades. So you should think of them, block groups and precincts are usually about the same size, a few thousand people. But they have no relationship at all, unfortunately. It's one of the things that makes the geodata problem really complicated.
Yeah, if you could just go back to the last slide for a sec. Thanks. Yeah, so it's worth noting that this impacts all levels of government, as high as the U.S. House of Representatives, state legislatures, county commissions, city councils, school boards, and more. Just looking at a really high-level example, this imaginary town has 25 residents that they need to split among 5 districts. To make sure the population is balanced, we want to put 5 people in each district, meaning each elected official will represent the same number of people. However, as you can see, even if we had this very small number of people, there are still a lot of ways we could draw these boundaries, which is why it's so important to make sure that we do it the best way. Next slide. Okay, so now just talking about why it matters so much. These lines are in place for 10 years, and they ultimately impact who has a voice, who can run for office, and who is elected. If your community is divided into multiple districts, it can be hard to draw attention to the issues that matter to your community. Whether you're concerned about the rent prices, or if your community is split into 2 or more districts, you'll have to go to multiple elected representatives with your concerns, and your voice gets diluted. Additionally, in most states, legislators usually redraw their own lines, allowing the government to choose its voters instead of the voters choosing the government. That's why having independent commissions and having community voices is so important, because it allows us to have a voice in our own legislators. Next slide.
So a question came in the chat. Aren't precincts drawn according to census blocks? So I think folks still have a couple questions about the building blocks. So let's pause and make sure we're being clear about that. So the census has a whole hierarchy of geographies: state, county, tract, block group, block. Blocks are the smallest, and in a city, a census block is usually the same as a city block. That's how small they are. They can have anywhere from 0 to typically a few hundred people, so they're the smallest units. You should think of those as like the pixels. They're the tiniest unsplittable atoms that you build things out of. So block groups are built out of census blocks, and precincts are typically also built out of census blocks. So the claim was that precincts and block groups kind of have no relationship, but they are both built from the same atoms. Does that make sense to Fran? And while we're paused, anyone have any other question at this point? All right, Julia, carry on.
Okay. So just looking at a redistricting example. So in this imaginary city, we have 40 dogs and cats. Cats represent 60% of the residents, while dogs represent 40%. So let's imagine there's 3 seats on the pet council, and we'll assume that cats will only vote for cats and dogs will only vote for dogs. There's 2 important things that these maps show: how districts can affect representation and how shape matters. So first, representation. Across these districts, the way the lines are drawn can lead to vastly different outcomes for cats and dogs. In scenario 1, over on the left, even though dogs are only 40% of the residents, they have 2 seats, or 67% of the representation, on the council just because the lines are drawn a certain way. In contrast, in scenario 3 on the right, there are no dogs on pet council. Given the way the districts are drawn, dogs don't have a chance to win the seat. Second, talking about shapes. Many states have rules about contiguity and compactness. Contiguity means the districts are one connected shape, and compactness means the district shapes are reasonable or pass the, quote, eyeball test. In scenario 2, it might look, the representation looks fair because 60% are cats and cats win 2/3 of the seats. But unfortunately, in scenario 2, 2 of the districts are these long L shapes, and they're not very compact. On the other hand, the shapes in scenario 3 look really appealing, but dogs have no representation. It's important to draw districts that both ensure representation and that also have, quote, nice looking districts. So in the next few slides, we'll focus on community mapping. Okay, so for the rest of the presentation, we want to focus on communities of interest, or COIs. The legal definition of a COI varies by state, but you can think of this as a group with significant shared interests that should be kept together. So on the slide are just some examples. For example, we could have beach towns that rely on tourism, all are united by this common economic goal. Similarly, small family farmers, commuters who rely on the same public transit, mountainous regions with unique environmental concerns, people working in the same industrial sector, or communities relying on the same public school system. So if anybody wants to put, we want a few suggestions in the chat of similar communities of interest. Put those there now.
Yeah, so this is actually a good point to really start brainstorming together, right? So the way that COIs have evolved, you can see all these different examples. In fact, the examples that you see here mostly are pulled from actual legal cases that affirmed the relevance of this kind of commonality for redistricting. And so the question would be, this is a great time to start thinking about it if you haven't been already, what is a kind of shared interest that you might see in a neighborhood or in a region of the state that really calls for a voice in government? In other words, what kind of people whose residence lines up territorially, right, who can sort of be identified on a map, might legitimately say, if they got fractured or fragmented into several pieces, that they were having a hard time having their interests heard. So Ben is suggesting college towns.
Yeah, that's a really good one, especially because that, their interests might differ from the people in the surrounding area, but those definitely have a common interest relating to the college.
Loki, and excuse me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, is asking, are COIs required to be compact or contiguous, as districts are, in theory, or can they be distributed minorities scattered around? If that, how can they be reflected? So one thing I would say to that is that actually the COI case law tells us that racial commonality on its own should not be the basis of a community of interest. So there are other areas of redistricting law that are more expressly racial. However, you'll find, because here we are to train you in how to collect these communities. And because race is such an important part of our lived reality, what you'll find is that when you start doing this and going out and interviewing people, very often when you ask, what do folks here have in common? The first answer will appeal to race. And so frequently what you can do as a trainer, and actually I think we'll get to this on other slides, but this is a preview. What you can do as a trainer is reorient that conversation a little bit, not by denying that that's an important thing to have in common, but by saying, great, and given that you have that in common, what are some interests in government that flow from that, right? And so that's a way to affirm that racial commonality is a really important part of people's experience of community and neighborhood, but to also collect information in a way that's going to be actionable under COI law. You want to add anything to that, Julia?
Yeah, no, that's really good. And we'll talk more about the race and political party thing later. So now just using a case study to talk about why communities matter. So the city of Lowell, Massachusetts, near Boston, was recently sued by a coalition of Latino and Cambodian residents. Lowell, one affluent neighborhood, Belvedere, was able to control a majority of seats on the city council, despite not making up a majority of the population. This year, the city is transitioning to elections with districts, and they have an opportunity to draw a map that will represent the people who live there. If the line drawers know where communities live, they can try to keep them together. So right here is shown a community narrative that we collected from a resident in Lowell. So Belvedere is an insular, affluent neighborhood which has controlled as many as 6 of the 9 seats at a time. On the other hand, the Acre, shown in blue, is an immigrant port of entry community with many important meeting places that has never had a representative on the city council. Slide. Yeah.
There's a question in the chat.
Okay. Yeah.
I think we answered it actually. Sorry.
Michael, do you want to just tell us what it is though?
Yep, the question was from Hassan. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. It was, what about poverty rates or socioeconomic demographics? So it was referring to communities of interest.
Yeah, and then the answer is absolutely. Poverty or other socioeconomic factors definitely are very essentially important parts of COI narratives. Other things that you can see in the case law, for instance, shared health concerns. So like if you have a cancer cluster that kind of relates to pollution and other kinds of environmental racism, that's a way to make a shared community concern legible in a COI framework. That's a great example. And as we go, I think we're going to switch pretty soon. In the interest of time, we have to make sure to switch pretty soon from presentation to some examples for collection. But I hope you guys will keep putting ideas into the chat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so the Lowell residents we spoke to mapped 7 communities in the city. Kat, if you could kind of mouse over these as I describe them, that would be helpful.
Actually, I'm not sure we have time for that, Julia. So let's sort of keep it high level so we can get to.
We'll go to the next slide then. Okay, so now navigating the COI narrative, historically public officials have had trouble preserving communities of interest because they don't know where the communities are despite having community narratives submitted in public comment. These narratives are generally verbal and very high level, which makes it hard to draw boundaries based on them. With Districtr, we can draw exactly where your community area is. To go with the maps, however, it's important to have a story about your community. We want public officials to know where the communities are in a quantitative way without losing the compelling story about what binds the community together. So when you're talking to a daycare center employee or a restaurant owner, make sure you capture the physical geography as well as the answer to these questions. And you can see those on the slide. So we can take a few minutes now to think of a community that you're a part of. So using the questions on the slide, can you write a sentence about your community in the chat?
There was a comment from Pete who asked, could retirees or voters over a certain age be a community of interest? And my answer to that is absolutely. It makes very good sense that in COI logic, that retirees have shared interests that need a voice. Could folks who are here suggest what some of those might be? How would you describe what a community with a lot of retirees might want to ask their representative to do to reflect their interests? What could make their lives better? What could make their neighborhood better? Does anyone have a suggestion or an idea for that?
I'd say Social Security legislation, possibly.
Yeah, absolutely. And
yeah,
so
definitely.
Medicare legislation.
That's a great answer because it ties the community identity to policy, right? And that's how you can start to craft really usable, actionable COI descriptions. Absolutely, medical services, social centers, maybe wider sidewalks, more restaurants close by, more walkable. This is exactly the kind of narrative we want to help you learn to tease out while you're mapping. Trish and Randy are asking a great question. Asking what is the scale of a COI? If it's on the order of hundreds of people, the factors that define the group can be much more fine-grained than if they have to be on the scale of thousands, of tens of thousands. This is very true. And so one thing that I hope that we'll be able to convey tonight, we have a lot of information we want to share with you, but one thing that we hope to be able to convey is collecting COIs and doing it well is the first step, but it's not the last step. And so what has to happen after that in order for it to become usable is that a synthesis or an aggregation has to happen to take all of the input that you receive when you're doing this work and kind of summarize it, unify it, and label it with scale as you hand it to the line drawing body, in this case, the commission. So some communities are going to be at an appropriate size to keep together for a legislative district. And others are of a good size to keep together for a congressional district. To give you a sense of the difference, imagine that you have a community of 300,000 people, right? it might make sense to try to keep that. That's a very big community. That might be a whole regional interest. That might be a suitable size to keep together in a congressional district, but it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to try to keep it together in a smaller district. Sometimes COI preservation runs into problems of packing or over concentrating voters who share certain kinds of voting preferences. So the question about scale is really important. And this is why you need folks, data savvy folks like our lab and lots of other groups out there, to take all the COI input and synthesize it into something that's gonna help the commission. They'll see it when they draw their lines. It'll help them in their work, right? So there's collection, synthesis, and then the line drawing at the end. Yes, and we will definitely share the slide deck with you. Great. So we should probably wrap this up. You want to take another couple sentences, Julia?
Yeah, just talking about the slide really quickly. There are certain questions that can be really helpful to ask in order to steer the conversation away from race and political party. So asking about common needs or concerns, we talked these can often be economic. One good question is, if there was a community meeting or a protest here, what might it be about? And this is a good way of getting people to think about what issues matter to this community. And again, what common cultural, work-related, and economic characteristics unite this community. So now we're just going to go on to districtr.org, and we're going to navigate to the community that we will have some people demonstrating. And so I'm going to pass it over, and Kat will show you how to use Districtr.
Great.
Before Kat, I'm sorry, go ahead, Moon.
No, actually, Michael, I'd love it if you would field some questions.
I was just going to say, before Kat speaks, we had a question by Anastasia, which she asked earlier, which was, what if folks say that they are citizens and that is a COI compared to undocumented folks?
So, Anastasia, I think one of the things that's so fascinating about COI collection is that you don't have a whole lot of control of what people will say. That's the beauty of people-powered and people-centered input, right? And so you could imagine people describing a shared interest that's an unsavory one, for instance, right? But the collection and the aggregation and the synthesis project has to come from a starting point of treating all kinds of input equally. However, at the end of the day, in order to make itself useful, synthesis and aggregation also has to look for common themes, for common features, areas where those themes occurred and where those keywords occurred, and then to try to line that up with the intent of the COI language. So that would be the stage at which, something that we might think of as a shared interest, but maybe not a very legitimate one, that would be a stage at which that could be considered. I did want to mention though, you could imagine a community centered around a lot of undocumented folks, right? Because it's very important, and your Virginia language actually specifies that the population basis for redistricting is all people, not just citizens, right? So we have a very strong concept that districts need to be balanced with respect to all the residents. So there's a really strong case to make that the interests of undocumented Americans can really be reflected through this process.
Yeah, and just real quick talking about Hashan's question, who asked, I know my immediate COI more or less for Senate and HOD districting, but how do you make one for congressional districts when you don't know it as well?
Right.
Is a community does not have to be a whole district. A community can be as small as just the people in your neighborhood. Congressional districts generally will be made up of multiple communities. And so you don't need to draw, this is my community and it's a whole giant area. We want to get just on the ground, small communities, and use those as building blocks.
Great. And I would also, it's a great point, Julian. I'd also add to that, all of the data that we collect in this way is going to be available to the people of Virginia in this case for all kinds of projects in the future. So we'll have a database of community input that's available the next time city council redistricting happens. So really keep in mind, districts happen, there are 90,000 districts in the country, and that's congressional to city council to ambulance districts and some school election districts, right? All kinds of districts. And the idea here in Districtr is you tell us where are the people who need a voice, and that becomes part of a big and rich data set that's going to have all kinds of applications in the future. Okay, so instead of turning to more questions right now, let's make sure we get to this demo. So Kat, are you driving this part?
Absolutely, yeah. So I have dropped the website districtr.org into my favorite search engine, and we have landed on this homepage. And the best way to start mapping our communities of interest are to go over to the right-hand side up at the top here and jump to the map. So I'm going to click on that. And as Julia mentioned, we have landing pages for all 50 states, as well as DC and Puerto Rico. But if we hover over Virginia, we can click on that and take a closer look. So we find this purple path as before, and we want to start drawing communities. So we're going to click on this to follow the red path. And we have two options. We can build out of block groups or out of precincts. So let's just see what precincts look like today. And clicking on this, hopefully this looks familiar and maybe a little bit like Google Maps or Apple Maps that you might see on your phone when you're navigating around town. So up on the top left here, we have some tools where we can zoom in or zoom out appropriately to find our communities. We can also use this search bar to zoom in closer. It could be a point of interest that's in your community or just a town. So let's zoom in on a town. And we're in Richmond. I also want to highlight some tools up at the top right here. We have a little hand tool that lets me pan across the map. Next to that, we have this little teardrop tool, which acts as a landmark tool where we can mark important places on our map that might be integral to your community of interest. There's also a paintbrush right next to that. And this is where we can actually start painting in our communities of interest. So I'll just demo that. We can make our brush sizes bigger or smaller. And in this description tab below here, we can name our community as well as describe it and say what is important, talking about those policy interests and common themes that are important to your community. Next to description, we also have data layers, which gives you more information about the demographics of your community, race and population, as well as next to that, there's an evaluation tool. So this community I've colored in here kind of randomly, we can compare this community one to the demographics of Virginia and see some population information as well. And back up at the top, we have an eraser tool in case I messed up, and we really don't want that to be part of our selection. And next to the eraser, we have a magnifying glass, which acts as an inspection tool. So we can hover over some of these building blocks and see more information about the total population. And then most importantly, in the very top right corner, once we're all done mapping our communities, we want to be able to share that information and compile it. So we have the option to press this share button, which creates a link here that I could copy and send to someone who's collecting this data. If this were connected to an event, I could enter an event code.
And actually, this makes it easy for you to take communities of interest and use a public input submission portal to tell the commission about them. So you can draw something here, give it a narrative, just copy this URL, and by sending it, anyone who clicks on that link is going to be taken to your communities with your description of why they matter.
And similarly, if we wanted to export this in another way, we have options to export our community in this map that you've drawn with this description as a JSON, as a shapefile, or as a CSV.
No, you wait.
And that shapefile export option will make it compatible with something that's running GIS or Maptitude. I think if there aren't any questions, Jorge is going to lead the interview.
So before Kat leaves, I wanted to point out a couple of things. If Kat could go to Google real quick. Sometimes, I know I do, I forget the endings to websites. Kat, if you could just go to the top search bar, I'm just going to show them how to get to it if you were in a regular search bar. So if you're in Internet Explorer or Safari or something like that, you typed in Districtr, but you forget the dot, it will bring you to a different page. And so once Kat gets there, I'll continue.
Do you want me to just Google it?
Yeah, just put a space after. So you'll get to this page and you'll see Districtr right there, and it's the first thing that comes up. But I just wanted to clarify, because sometimes if you forget the .org or you do .com and you get to a different page and you can't figure out how to get where we were, you can just type in Districtr without anything in Google, and it'll be the first thing that you're at. Another key thing, if Kat will go back to the original page she was working on, MGG, or the Districtr program, does a really good job of highlighting things before you do anything to them. So for example, if you want to erase or you want to paintbrush in something, while you're hovering over it, it will show you what it's going to adapt, which will stop you from erasing things you didn't mean to or painting over things you didn't mean to. So you can hover over it, you see it's a grayed area, you're like, okay, that's what I want, or oh, it's not what I want, and you can change the size of your paintbrush if necessary, and that will make it a little bit easier while you're doing these districting tasks. And the last thing I wanted to say was that make sure you regularly save your projects. I know in a lot of applications, and Districtr is included, sometimes it might automatically save after you click save once. It will update it as you keep going, but you always want to make sure you click save right before you copy your URL or you do anything else, because you would hate to have an old version saved, and when you go back to it, you have an outdated version, which is not what you meant to save.
Thank you, Michael. That's great. A question came up in the chat. What's an event? So this is worth spending a couple sentences on. So here where it says have an event code, we use the word event two different ways in Districtr. One is as a tag that you can put on your map. So for instance, if you're affiliated with a group like the League of Women Voters, you could tag with an event code LWV and just hit add to event. And what that does is on the back end where the district data lives, or in this case, the COI data, we remember that you're affiliated with LWV. And what that means is that when the league comes and asks us, hey, who put in maps that are tagged with our organization, we'll be able to collect those and pass them along. There's actually something here that's worth emphasizing. One of the things about Districtr that's different from, I think, every other mapping software that I've ever seen is, did you notice, like, you can just go to the browser and just start. We didn't ask for a login. We didn't ask you to make an account. We didn't ask for your email address, and we don't collect any information about users. So all that we have is the maps people make, and those are only as informative about the user as the user chooses to make them. Okay. Quickly, a second thing that's called an event, we also have an organizer view. And were you guys planning to show that tonight? Or if not, I can do that. I'll show you that later if we have time. But if you want to host an event in your community, we can create an event page for you. And on that page, you can have links into the different kinds of modules like this map that you can draw in. And you as the organizer will get to see in real time every map that's being drawn for your event. So if anyone tags their map with the name of your event, you'll be able to see thumbnails of all of those maps live. And the intent here is to make it easier for you as engaged districting enthusiasts to be able to magnify your effect. Host an event, have lots of people draw, make it social, have it on Zoom. It's a good way to talk to sort of exponentially grow the list of people who are doing a great job collecting this kind of input. You don't have to sign up or request the code, but if you tell us in advance that you want an event, we'll make an organizer view page for you. But you can just tag events. You can make up an event code and tag it with anything, and then only later we can collect according to whoever put that code in. So it's meant to be maximally flexible and to require the least amount of advanced information. All right, so who's up next?
All right, now Michael and I are going to do a kind of like a mock interview on how to kind of like go about asking people to map their communities of interest. So here we are at the kind of like the map again, and I know Michael is from Connecticut, so we're going to go there. And again, we have these two different paths. So to draw communities, we're going to follow the red path and start building them out of block groups. And again, just like in the interest of time, I already know Michael is from Monroe. So as soon as this loads, I'm going to go up to the search bar and put in Monroe, Connecticut, and it's going to take us there.
Actually, let me just mention what these guys are about to demo for you is something that we really recommend that you try yourself. Namely, instead of just sitting there by yourself and drawing your own community, do it in pairs or do it in threes and interview each other, which is what these guys are about to do. Jorge's going to be interviewing Michael. We have come to learn from watching people do map collection that having one person interview the other is a great way to be sure that they're drawing out the kind of information that really makes their community come to life.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess I'm going to start off by asking Michael to kind of like describe his community, like who is in your community in particular.
So, as we were talking about earlier, there are many different communities in a specific area. One of the communities that I'm a part of is my town of Monroe has a lot of children and younger families or families with young children, and they're present throughout the community, and they have a couple of areas that they go to often. They congregate and hang out.
All right, cool. So since there are like a lot of young people in your area, children in particular, where do you think, or at least like where do you know that these people hang out in your community? Where do they gather?
So one place that they gather would be something you can see in the bottom left of the screen, William E. Wolf Park. Wolf Park
This one?
Yep, right there. Wolf Park has a lot of activities for families. They have a pool. They have that lake you can see there. They have a little beach on top of it. They have soccer fields, a ton of different tennis courts. They have a jungle gym. They have a ton of different things where kids can go and families can make memories.
All right. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna like make Wolf
real
Park.
estate ad, Michael.
What was it? One of the important places in this community, since it's shared by a lot of the residents there. So Michael kind of like described it as like a community area with sports fields that a lot of people go to. There's like a lake, so there's like a lot of fishing in the area with beaches.
Let's make sure Michael agrees. And also, Michael, I would ask, like, what are the kinds of interests? What about this park might give people a need to communicate with their representative? What might they be asking the representative?
So one of the key things about this park is it's full of nature. So because of the fishing, because it's very scenic, there are bike paths nearby. It's one of the few places within the town where you can go and kind of quote unquote feel one with nature. So there'd be a lot of environmental needs and concerns surrounding this park with wanting to keep it clean and wanting to keep the town clean so that it's able to be used in the future.
So upkeep might be a need. Okay,
Yep.
That's great.
All right, cool. So that's one community. So we're gonna go ahead and add that one. And now, like, where else do you think the I guess like the people and children in your area hang out?
So because Wolf Park is a point, we call it a point of interest. And another point of interest would be where these kids actually go to school. There's a school area nearby, which has Jockey Hollow Middle School. I think it's up to the left, that little yellow area.
Right here.
Yep, Monroe Public Schools. Yep, so there's a middle school and an elementary school in this area. And so there are also like soccer fields and a couple of other areas for children activities. But between here, Wolf Park, and a couple of other spots, a lot of children grow up in these communities and grow up in these schools.
And so what might be a need that people in this area have in terms of government services or attention from their elected officials?
So I know one need is for education. Sometimes the schools are underfunded and they don't have, or they have certain programs that they normally fund, which they have low funding for the next year because of how money's moved. So there's a need to protect the schools and protect the Girl Scouts and protect all of the organizations that the kids want to participate in.
Great. So it sounds like community meetings here might be about these themes.
Yep.
All right, cool. So we're going to add that second point of interest. And now that we have like kind of like two places that we know the community gathers around, maybe we can start like drawing the community. So where exactly do the people that use these two areas live?
So I definitely would say there are people who live right around Wolf Park. there are people who are part of that community. And also, I know a lot of families who take the bus to go to those elementary schools also live in the areas right around those schools.
All right, so you say like I should paint in this block right here.
Yep, that worked just fine. Thank you.
All right,
It's
and
definitely
I guess like
block. And then, yes, definitely in between, there would be, and so south of Main Street, I guess south is what you can call it. So to the right of Main Street on this map, that would also be included because going past Main Street goes a little bit into Hatterton. And so definitely the block that includes the schools would be included.
And don't forget, these are
All right.
block groups.
Right, block groups. Thank you, Moon. And then in between on the Elm Street block group, that would also be included.
Right here. Do you think we should include the Monroe Turnpike block group?
Not necessarily. I think that's good. I think that captures.
Right, this is your whole community right here.
That's the community.
All right, so I guess like now that we like have the community mapped out, I guess we can start describing it. So, what exactly would you name this community?
You could say young families or families with young children, which have shared interest of environmental concerns, educational concerns, and extracurricular activities. The people who live in this area are middle to upper class because Monroe is one of the wealthier towns, and they often do have children under 20 years old because a lot of families, I've seen them move out once their children become older. The parents may move to a different part of the state or to a different state altogether. So we really do have young families in this area.
All right, and I guess like maybe like a part of the demographic. Do you think it would be like a pretty like diverse demographic or predominantly like one race or another?
Gotcha. This community is predominantly Caucasian. It is not.
And actually, that would be something that's not really necessary to prompt them about because race can often be a helpful way to get to the shared interest, but probably it can't be actually at the center of our COI narrative. So it's a good thing that came up. It is going to come up. It's an important way that we think about where we live. But maybe some ways of talking about race that don't run afoul of that guidance would be to talk about whether it's diverse, whether it has immigrants from different kinds of areas, whether it has meeting places that correspond to different kinds of cultural commonality, including countries of origin. Those are all ways of talking about community, not expressly racial, that fit a little bit better with the COI kind of legal themes. Okay, well, I see we're winding down in the time that we have left. But Michael and Jorge, anything you want to add when thinking about this process?
I think that for the most part, like that was like a lot of it, mainly just like mapping the points of interest, and then going back and like describing what like where the people who use those points kind of live, and that usually like, gets you a good sense of the community that is in that area.
Right, and then actually, I would say while you're here, if you flip over to evaluation, I just want to show people a cool feature in Districtr. So whatever community you just drew, so Michael's young family's community, we can now get some stats. So actually, you were right, Michael. It's heavily white. And so we can actually see the census data that's attached to those block groups. So at the moment, we have population and voting age population. But talk to us if you think some other census data would be valuable to see for the communities that you draw. As I mentioned earlier, that could have to do with access to cars, access to internet, with rates of high school graduation and so on. The Census Bureau, through its American Community Survey, obtains all kinds of detailed socioeconomic and demographic data that's attached in every. Okay, let's take a couple other questions and then we really do hope to end on time. So let's see, we have Pete saying, I don't know if Connecticut communities have BOS as Virginia counties do. So actually you should tell us what that is. Would these needs be best addressed by local governments rather than delegates or state senators? So what does BOS stand for? Okay, we'll wait and find out about that. But Bureau of Labor Statistics. Okay, well, no, probably not.
Pete,
So-
can you unmute yourself and tell us what BOS refers to? Or maybe Board of Supervisors?
Board of Supervisors, great. Yeah, I think this was part of the point that I was trying to express earlier, which is that when we're doing this collection, the idea is to be really driven by the narratives that people have about where they live, who they share their neighborhoods and community with, what they have in common, and what they need. So we would encourage you, as you collect these kinds of community input, not to be very end-oriented, but to be very means-oriented. That is, to really think about what folks have in common and what their needs are. Because the collection, yes, right now is oriented to congressional and legislative districts, because that's the task of your new commission. But we hope that it'll be usable at many different levels of government, and not only for districting, but also just for people to get to better, for the electeds, for the public servants to get to better understand the communities that they're serving. So I think we have just a minute left. Sharon's asking how to get the recording of this great meeting. Thank you, Sharon. And so I think Chris will tell us how that can happen. I just want to put some contact info for our Districtr team in the chat and say we would absolutely love to hear from you, the folks at Districtr. We have a wonderful team of staff and then this army of like unbelievably fantastic students. And I want to take a moment to thank Liz Kopecki in particular, who's the project manager, who's really made so much of what we do with Districtr possible. And so Liz is here tonight, and thank you, Liz. And I want to, thanks, Liz. And I want to thank these awesome students for taking some time out and joining us and being so great on tape.
You have a great team there.
Yeah, so I'll pass it back to you, Chris, to wrap up.
Okay, thanks very much. So we are recording. We recorded the, we'll record tomorrow's when the Districtr team will also present again at, this will be 12 noon tomorrow. So if you have friends who would like to join, it'll be the same link that you used to access our Zoom tonight. And we also, recorded the 2 representable presentations as well. We're going to put them on our league website. We have a YouTube channel. I can probably try and find that link in a little bit. I believe One Virginia 2021 Foundation will also post them elsewhere. So hopefully that will help. So again, tomorrow we'll have the team. I don't know if it'll be exact same people. It might be the same great team or different students joining us at 12 noon. And we hope that you'll all start playing with the tool and start mapping out your community. You can try it, by yourself first, but I think that idea of working with someone else and interviewing each other is a great one. So you can start doing that and, engage other people. Talk to your civic federation, talk to your church groups, your PTAs, your neighbors, see if they would like to get involved. Because a lot of times they have an idea of they'd like to, they have a lot of things to share that they share in common. So they may like to participate in this too. So again, I think we've got a few weeks to work with this. Maybe, as Spoon said, it might be months before they actually start drawing maps. But it's a great way to get involved. This is a new, exciting situation for Virginia that we can get involved so much. And we have a bipartisan committee, which will be led by a citizen. So thanks very much for coming. If you want to leave, you can. We're just about past 8, but will the team be around for a little while? If somebody wants to ask a question, you can just unmute yourself and ask.
You bet. Happy to stick around for a couple more minutes.
Hey, this is Prentice. I had to step away for a little bit, but hi. So there's 2 questions that I'm sure you all answered and I missed it. It seems like all of the community of interest data, the data collection happens in the tool Redistrictr. So like when you're taking the data, you're just putting it right into the tool. Is that right?
Sort of. So when you click the share button, the server saves a copy of your work. Okay. But it doesn't go anywhere. It's not like sent automatically to the officials of your state. For that, you need to share it yourself, or you need to be organized with a group that collects and shares. So for instance, as you already heard, there is already an input submission portal set up for Virginia. So you could take the URL from the map that you draw and just submit it as part of your comment. And then they'll be able, just by clicking that URL, to see all of the work that you did.
Yep,
so we really do a minimum of data harvesting, just enough to make it possible that you can go back to your own work later. That's really, it's actually one of our core principles, one of our design principles when we sat down. This tool's been in development for 3 years now, actually. We have a terrific team of people who help make it possible. And when we sat down and said, what's important to us? The fact that none of this data is ever commercialized, used without your permission, attached to your name in any way, all of that was pretty important to us as some first principles for design. And the other one, and I hope you can tell from playing around with the tool, and please, please, please play around with the tool. So I hope you can tell it's engineered for maximum accessibility. So you can get right in the browser and start using it, but you can also put it on an iPad and draw your community with your finger. It's meant to be the most usable, as opposed to something that's meant to have every single metric and all the features. Students or Liz, anything you want to add to that?
So since we don't create an account, if I want to go back and edit or look at my map again, how do I find it? Do I have to remember the name of the map?
No, you don't. Actually, Jorge, the map you were just collecting, can you throw the URL for that into the chat?
Yes, I can.
So when you hit share, it generates a link, and then you or anyone else can go right back into your map and keep editing. But the key is, if someone else or you, if you jump in there later and do more editing, when you hit share, it'll have a new URL. So you can't overwrite someone's work, but this is a really cool feature. Actually, I'm glad you brought it up. If you want to work with friends, you can start and pass it to your friend who continues and passes it on, and it can branch off in different ways, right? So that maps can truly be collaborative in the Zoom age. And you can see here, Jorge's dropped in the COI that they began in Monroe.
So one question.
Should we share it and copy the link and email it to ourselves? I mean, how do we even remember the link?
Yourself. People have been tweeting them. You can do kind of anything that involves text entry. You can share the link that way. Absolutely. Email
save the link somewhere.
I have a whole horde of these I've emailed to myself. That's certainly a thing. So sorry, Prentice.
Yeah, I was going to say, it just makes me think that for Ohio, as we're thinking about the sort of the zones, like, are we going to like, I'm thinking like, are we going to create a map of a zone and that becomes like the base map for the rest, for people who are working in that area? And I'm wondering if that might make it easier to divide up a state.
There are so many possibilities here. So absolutely, you can, and actually Prentice here is an organizer from Ohio who's interested in using Districtr in Ohio. And so one thing that he's referencing is the whole state might feel really, really big. And you might want a more manageable piece of the state as where the map begins. And if so, another strength of Districtr is that it's built to be adaptable. So we can build a mapping module for your locality. It can be your county because you want a new county commission, or it can just be an informal zone of the state. You come to us, you tell us where it is, and we can make a map specific to that area. And sometimes also, if you choose a small city or town, then block groups might not be the best units anymore. You might want those smaller pixels. And so we have lots of examples of this in Districtr. If you, for instance, go into Pennsylvania and look at Philadelphia, we have Philadelphia all the way down to the census block, those tiny little pixels. And that's another advantage of picking a smaller focus area, is that you can use smaller pieces to draw. Okay, I'm going to throw Hashan's question to the students. So, and just take a crack at it if you feel like it, and otherwise I'm always here to have opinions. So with the commission getting potentially hundreds of thousands, well, that would be cool, but we'll see, of input COIs, how are they going to assess them? How do we make sure we stand out so they pay attention to our COI input? I like that question. I like the framing. So students, you want to take a crack, and then I'll also try and weigh in. Any thoughts? What would you do if you were going to try to stand out? What would be a good way to collect input that's going to stand out? And then also, I like Lavano's question. What about correct information and not fake news? Oh, sorry, fake info. Students, thoughts? This is like my favorite thing to do. You can see I'm a like teacher in my heart, and like calling on students is my favorite. It's my hobby.
I would say,
let's have Michael and then Kat.
Okay. I would say that if you might be able to more clearly see fake info from real info based off of the number of I guess the average. So for example, if everyone who actually lives in the community of interest is like, this is the area and it's pretty similar, there might be slight variations between the maps, but generally it's a certain area. And you have another person who's like, no, it's way over here. But you have a couple of hundred that have pretty much the same map, then you can be able to separate fake communities of interest from, or fake depictions of the community of interest from the real one. And also if you have, especially with points of interest, if you have people who have the communities of interest and they all have their own points of interest and you see the most popular points of interest between a lot of maps, you can say, okay, well, a lot of people think these are the important points and these should probably be in the community of interest for the final version. And then you might be able to average out and wean out some of the different borders between different maps.
Absolutely. And I would just add to that it cuts both ways when you see something many times. So many of you have probably heard of the phrase AstroTurf, right? Which is like fake grassroots. That's why it's called AstroTurf. It's like plastic grass. And so for instance, you might have an organization that like puts together a letter to the editor and then gives it to 1,000 people who all submit it as though it were their own letter to the editor, right? That's the kind of thing that people are usually talking about when they talk about AstroTurf. So the data science techniques that we're putting together to aggregate all of these submissions, they look for communities that were referenced many times in many not quite exactly the same ways. If we're starting to see the exact same thing with some of the same wording repeated over and over, we'll downweight that in the end as likely AstroTurf rather than consensus. So we're using kind of cutting edge data science techniques to look for clustering in terms of the narratives and the keywords that people use. But by the same token, those techniques notice when things are too identical and too often repeated and then start to downweight it at a certain point. Kat, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, to the point of how would I make a map stand out? I think thinking about those key terms that we were talking about earlier and what we heard in the interview where Moon and Jorge were really pulling out information from Michael about what made his community something that stands out and has specific policy interests that should have a voice in their community. And so answering those types of questions and steering away from questions of race or political leanings, I think will give your map a stronger sense in this greater field of all the options.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Like the better you can defend your community of interest, the more weight it will be given. If somebody just leaves it with no description, then that's not going to be weighted as heavily as one that can clearly explain why this is a community of interest and why it's important to keep it together. And also labeling those points of interest are another way to make sure that's additional data that not everyone will necessarily give. So in general, the better you can tell a story with your community, the more valuable that will be and the more it will stand out.
Yeah, I think that's the really important point to keep in mind is remember what COIs are for. And the more you can connect the communities that you draw and that you mark and that you label to narratives that need representation, the stronger of a case that we can make when we aggregate all the submissions, the stronger of a case we can make that an area really coheres. I think as we wind down, and I want to acknowledge districting has a long history. The US is absolutely in love with districts. They're like a building block of American democracy from the very founding. And if you go all the way back in American history and you try to look for the logic, why do we love districts so much? You actually go back to the Federalist Papers and you watch Hamilton and Madison kind of duking it out about what districts are even for. What are they even for, right? They're there to create a vehicle to take local interests and send them to the larger body. So for congressional districts, you're taking local interests and sending them to DC, to the National Congress. And for the legislature, you're taking even more local interests and you're sending them to the state legislature. Yeah, thanks, friend. Districts are for gerrymandering, also true. And so the point is, the more you can say about what those shared interests are, the more you're helping districts live up to their purpose and their potential, their higher potential and not their like lowest potential, right? You're helping districts be better by actually returning to their function, which is to take those aspects that really call for a policy voice and identify them and speak for people who haven't necessarily always been given the resources to speak for themselves. What could be more important in our currently ailing American democracy? Okay, so maybe that's a great place to start to wind down, but I emphasize again, we would love to hear from you. Let's give these students a round of applause, please. Thanks, guys. You're awesome. And we will wish you good night. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thanks for being here, and thanks for everyone for coming. I forgot to put the YouTube channel in. I just put it in if anyone's still online, but I'll share it
It's gonna
later.
get loaded on the YouTube channel.
Yeah, that's where we'll post it.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Great to meet you all.
Thank you.